Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we continue our study of the book of Job, the Sefer Eov, chapter 25, that is Perek Chaf Hey. We are in the third round of discussions between Eov's three friends and him. And Eov in chapters 23 and 24 just finished a scathing but uh, powerful demonstration of the lack of visible justice in this world. We look at the world around us and we see people suffering. And Eov pointed out that we don't know, and none of us know, how God metes out his justice. There is no way for us to understand it. And Eov also pointed out that you, in other words, my friends, because you think you understand it, you end up accusing me and others wrongly of wrongdoing, because you say if I'm suffering, it must be because of sin. This chapter that's coming up is the answer of Bildad Hashuchi, the second of the three friends, the response to Eov. And in this response, we will hear something which we often hear, and that is the justice that we don't see here today is maybe we don't see it, but that's because one day there will be justice in some future or some heavenly realm. There will be justice there. This is an answer that is given to the problem of theodicy, that what we see in front of us isn't all there is something else up there. For Eov, that is not enough of an answer, because the bottom line, why am I suffering if I never did anything wrong to deserve the suffering, which is what Eov is going through. But in the eyes of Eov's friends, this is a somewhat of an advanced answer. Ultimately, the real answer we know, and I might be going ahead of myself. Actually, the real answer. Who knows the real answer? I don't mean to come out that way. There is no real answer to theodicy. It's a question we've been grappling with and will be grappling with for all time. But the issue is that the lack of understanding is part of the answer. In other words, Eov actually is much closer to the true answer, as we know, than the friends. Because when we seek to think that we understand God, and we think to understand that God's justice works in the way that we want it to work, that in itself is arrogance. But here we have the three friends' answers, and let's hear what Bildad has to say today in chapter 25, which is, as I mentioned before, a very short chapter. Vayan Bildad Hashuchi Vayomar. And Bildad the Shuchite answered as follows and said, Hamshel v'fachad imo. The rulership, in other words, or dominion over us, and the pachad, which literally means the fear, are both with God. In other words, God has the control. God is the one who makes these decisions. God is the one who has dominion over us, and we are nothing. And oseh shalom bimromav, and the place where he makes the peace, where he evens out these injustices that we see, that you so eloquently enumerated in the last chapter, is in Meromav, is in his heavens. That's where he makes the peace. And then he says, in other words, God for sure is doing the right and just thing. And how could we think that he doesn't? How could we think that God doesn't? Hayesh mispar ligdudav. Can you even count the troops, the soldiers that God has? V'almi lo yakum orehu. And on whom does the light of God not shine? And the light of God, the sun shines upon all of us. Umay yitzdak enosh im el. And here he introduces an idea which is also introduced often, and that is that by our very nature, nature of being so small and so tiny and so human, we deserve punishment in the face of God. This is an idea which Eov clearly does not agree with. Eov has stated many times, number one, the fact that I am so low, if anything, should mean, why bother punishing me? Who am I that you even bother? And even more so, that makes us even more innocent. But this idea that being human makes us guilty is an idea that smacks of an idea that doesn't really fly in in Judaism, and that is the idea that we're somehow inherently guilty. An idea, which does show up in other philosophies. But in this book, we are here rejecting that, because it's coming out of the mouth of the friends, where Eov is rejecting that idea. And here he says, "Umayitzdak and Oshimel." How could a human being be just? And here, when it says just here, it's just in the sense of a court case. In other words, how could a human being be innocent in the eyes when he's compared with God? And how could a person born of a woman be ever zocha, be ever not guilty, like in a court case? In other words, a human being is always guilty. So we always deserve some punishment. And, the fact that what we see in front of us doesn't necessarily always reflect Oseh Shalom b'mramav, God makes that peace in the heaven. Hein ad yoreach, right? Even even the moon, right? V'lo ya'ahil, right? V'chochavim lo zaku be'einav, and the this is this verse 5 is a little difficult to translate. There's various understandings. I'm going to go a little with the Ramban here, which is similar to Rashi's understanding, and that is that this is a reference. This verse 5 is a reference to the greatness of God and how small we are in His comparison. Because when we look up at the sun and the moon and the stars, these are things that are so bright and powerful beyond our control that we have no way of controlling those things. We have no these are things that control us. They regulate our lives. However, God, hein ad yoreach v'lo yahil, God looks unto the moon v'lo yahil, and He can make the moon not give light. In other words, God can cause the moon to go through its phases and give darkness. And some say this refers to the time in the future when the moon will maybe no longer give light. V'chochavim, and the stars lo zaku be'einav, even those are not pure in His eyes. In other words, we look up at the stars as things that are fixated in the sky that will always be, but God can end stars. God can make stars go away. Afki enoshri ma, however, a human being, if even those things are nothing in the eyes of God, how much more so a human being is just wormy, uven adam tolea, and the son and the human being who is just food for maggots. So how much more so is the human being who is nothing? This also reflects the Aristotelian and philosophical notion that the beings in the sphere within which we exist on this world, human beings, come and go. They are generated and corrupted. We come, we are born, and then we die, and then we rot. Whereas the celestial beings are constant and always. As this verse is saying, but even the celestial beings are not constant before God, how much more so are we small before Him? So here, the difference here between Eov and Bildad is that Eov is stating that yes, I agree, they both talk about the smallness of man before God, but in Eov's conclusion, that a man is so small before God that we cannot possibly understand how God works. And he laments the fact that we don't understand. And if we don't understand, what's the purpose and what's the point? That's the struggle that Eov is dealing with. Whereas Bildad starts with the same point. Man is so small before God, but therefore he concludes he deserves to suffer. And therefore man deserves to suffer, a concept, an idea that in some religions takes a form of original sin, but in the religion of Judaism, we go with Eov here. And that is that we're so small, how could we possibly understand God? How could we possibly come to His, to understand? So this concludes Bildad's very short little response to Eov. You almost get the sense that Bildad is frustrated. He reached the point he'll never agree with Eov, so he just makes this little point and goes on. And in chapter 26, we will hear Eov's response to Bildad, and we'll continue studying this together. Thank you so much for studying this book of Job, this Sefer Eov, together with me. Looking forward to studying chapter 26. and of course the rest of this incredibly powerful book of Eov together. Have a wonderful day.